Molo Sanbonani, hello, how's it? Good evening and shalom. Welcome to another episode of Liberty and Friends, your Sunday evening news weekly roundup show here on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. My name is Sihle Ngobese, Big Daddy Liberty. Welcome to it, welcome to it, welcome to it. Goodness me, folks, it has been a while since I've seen you, especially after that rather disappointing attempt at a stream last week Sunday, which saw a comedy of errors, really, with a failure of the network. Remember, and no, I don't mean the 5th of November, I mean rather share this stream. Hit that share button right now, get more people watching the show, and of course, hit that like button. And let's get the show going. I have a veritable mix of guests tonight who really do traverse the spectrum of intellectual thought. But before I get to my guests, a reminder to you, please, get on to that like button. Smash it, please. Let's keep the engagement over 50%. There's about 80 of us watching the show collectively across all streams. Remember, this show is simulcast on Facebook, Twitter, and on YouTube. So please, guys, hit that like button as I even waffle away here. Speaking about waffling away, I'm currently on a mini road tour as I pilot a new show that I want to have on the Big Daddy Liberty Show, a new series that I want to start on the BDL show. It'll be called the Mazakele stream. Mazakele, remember, is a Zulu word for meaning do it, or rather build it yourself. As we run up to the local government elections, this is the message I want to push into communities around the country, that no politician will save you. No political party is here to be your knight in shining armor. No, you and only you are responsible for improving your lot in life. And the best way you do that is by banding together with fellow South Africans, family, as a family, of course, as individuals, and really as a community, and fixing the issues that you face in your community. To that end, rather, I'm showcasing South Africans who are currently doing that in what I can only describe as dorpies around the town where services have already failed. So look forward to that as of next week, the pilot of what will be the Mazakele campaign, or rather the Mazakele series. The first of those episodes will flight next week, Wednesday, on the BDL show, as I take you inside Grahamstown and its collapse at the moment. So welcome to it, guys. Welcome to it. I see you guys trickling in. I see the comments, guys. Please keep that engagement over 50%. Hit that like button right now. Do it now. Do it now. You are saving a child in Africa from starvation if you hit that like button. So hit that like button right now. And with that being said, I can see my guests lolling away here. Let me bring them on, because as always on this show, Liberty and Friends, we look at the news week that was. What are some of the headlines that got you talking? Maybe had you become angry or interested, intrigued, and you're looking for more opinion and analysis on that. Here on this show, we provide exactly that. So let me bring on my first guest, a familiar face, and one who is going to be, and is, excuse me, I shouldn't say going to be, but already is a regular here on Liberty and Friends. I'm talking, of course, by my good friend, Analyst at the Free Market Foundation, Chris Hattingh. Hey, tada, Chris, there you are on screen. Good evening.
How are you, sir?
Good, my brother. Good to have you on. I am having a slight sound issue. Just give me a second there, Chris. As I sort out my sound, I'm going to be a little... There we go. Chris, do you want to hit us again with sound?
Coming in. Can you hear me? Woody eye.
Chris, good evening. Welcome to Liberty and Friends, my brother. And with that being said, let me bring on my next guest, another familiar-ish face, insofar as we've had him on the Big Daddy Liberty Show to discuss another issue which is rather close to my heart, and that is the issue of secession and the possible secession of a province like the Western Cape, and in my particular terms, or rather what I would prefer to see, KwaZulu-Natal. I'm talking, of course, about Upra Phil, Big Phil, Craig, who is from the Cape Advocacy Group. Phil, good evening.
Hi, Silly. Nice to be with you again. I rather like the sound of this Mazikele. I would argue that Cape Independence is exactly that.
Amen.
People banding together to...
No, I was about to say, shout out to the Cape Independence Group. We're going to get into that tonight because there was a, let's call it a development this week, which is worthy of a bit of analysis and opinion. Speaking of opinion and really good ones that he often brings to the stream, 1/3 of the trio at Manpatria. That's, remember, the Manpatria podcast. Those details are in the descriptor. I really encourage you to follow that show. I'm talking, of course, about Koketso Resane. Koketso, good evening.
Yeah, evening to you, evening to everyone else. I can't find my prescriptions anywhere, but I can see you. Hopefully you can see me.
Well, I'm hard to miss, so I'll bank on that being, for ease of sight in that regard. Speaking about easy on the sight, if you will, or easy on the eye. Yes, I just pulled a sexist joke there. Feminists, beware. I'm talking, of course, about the chief editor of the Daily Friend. Remember, you've got to make the Daily Friend your go-to for all news, analysis, and opinion. That's www.dailyfriend.co.za. Who am I talking, of course, about? Sara Gone. There she is on the screen. Sara, good evening.
Hi, Sikhle. I'll take the sexist remark at this age.
You and I both at this stage. Guys, good evening. Welcome to everybody. We are warm and toasty up in here. A reminder to you, dear viewer, I'm going to give you a second just for you to get up and get that warm drink to sip, so that you can watch the show and be a little buzzed. After the short break, we pick up the conversation with the panelists around some of the things that made the news this week. Welcome back. The breaks on this show are always very short. Welcome to it. Guys, I'm going to begin as I just quickly open my notes, which I must admit to the viewer are relatively makeshift. Because I'm on the road, I'm not as slick as I will usually be. So bear with me, dear viewer, as I go through my notes over here. Guys, I'm going to begin at the top because it has been an issue which I think has plagued every single South African right now and plunged all of us into a collective despair that comes from the darkness of it all. I'm talking, of course, about the Eskom and load shedding, which this week saw us hit a new high for this year, because we have had worse before, but a new high for this year of stage 4 load shedding. Chris, I'm looking to you first, because we've had this conversation about the nature of SOEs, that is state-owned enterprises, and how they're terrible at delivering pretty much anything.
We shouldn't complain. The socialists promised perfect utopia and equality, and we're getting perfect equality. We're all sitting in darkness, so we shouldn't complain too much about that. Look, I also think we shouldn't call it load shedding. We should call it rolling blackouts or rolling power cuts. I think we're being too kind when we say load shedding. It's the inevitable result of the state maintaining its monopoly in electricity generation and distribution. The SOE, that is Eskom, has been hollowed out in terms of skills and the capacity to actually run it very well. And it doesn't have to respond to market forces. So when it fails, it gets government bailout after government bailout. Those resources, which could be used for service delivery for poorer South Africans, are simply used to keep Eskom and South African Airways in the skies, as it were, unfortunately. So the inevitable result, there was a good announcement in that line this week, and I'm letting myself be hopeful. I mean, I'm probably going to, in the next 5 or 10 years, I'm going to be proven wrong by reality, because in South Africa, maybe when the government's involved, you shouldn't get too hopeful. But we can unpack that in a bit more, because I think there might be light at the end of the tunnel. And it's not the government taking the right decisions. It's not the government being proactive, being enlightened. It's the government being forced into this position because their policies and their ideologies have pushed them into this position.
Absolutely. Koketso, I'm going to come to you because Chris raises an important point here. It's the ideology, that really drives us into this ever deepening hole, if you will, where no matter how much good announcements or favorable announcements we hear, and we will get to that. We'll get to the announcement of the 100 megawatts allocation being allowed, because that also comes as a double-edged sword. But I want to just focus for me on a moment on the economic devastation that has absolutely been wrought on by Eskom just this week and really this year, with this week taking that dip into level 4.
Yeah, it's actually very devastating. You talk to business owners all over the country, and they'll tell you that, look, at the end of the day, you need some semblance of electricity to actually do business. And I don't think you can actually measure the economic impact of what load shedding has actually done. You can try your level best too, but I don't think it's actually measurable, because this is people's livelihood that's on the table here. Maybe to add on to what Chris was saying as well, is that the people who are available, who will freely even give the advice to Eskom on how to get things to where they need to be, are actually playing out flatly ignored. And for me, that's a concern, because as a business owner, if you have a struggling business, you're willing to take the advice on how to turn things around. And Eskom doesn't have that, because they know that in the worst case scenario, you can always go to Pretoria with a begging bowl, and you'll be sorted out with yet another bailout. So unfortunately, that's the position we're in. I have no hope whatsoever, unless things drastically change, of course. But yeah, let's just wait and see.
Absolutely. With that being said, a reminder to you, you're watching Liberty and Friends. We've just hit the 15-minute mark. This is a 90-minute show, so welcome to it. Please hit that like button. I assure you, it really does help get the show out. In conversation with Koketso Resane, who is a co-host of the Manpatria show, Sara from the Daily Friend, Chris Hattingh, of course, who's from the Free Market Foundation, and there he is, Big Phil Craig from the Cape Indepence Advocacy Group. Sara, let me come to you, because again, it's important as we continue in this conversation to always remind the viewer that this is not a new phenomena. Load shedding is not a new phenomena. It basically started plaguing us in around 2007, and there was a very fantastic tweet that was put out by Gareth van Onselen, basically charting that there will be a generation in 2 years who have literally, if they were born in 2007, have never known a South Africa outside of load shedding. Is that not just the biggest indictment on the ANC?
I'd like to add to a list of big indictments, but let's go with that one. The fact that, I think 2008 was when load shedding started. But what was really scary is even by then, there was a lot of criticism of the ANC, because they had been getting advice for nearly 10 years before that to do something about Eskom. And both in terms of additional generation power, as well as dealing with the fact that stuff was crumbling, the infrastructure was crumbling. And I think you almost got the impression that they were on a sort of the high of being the government in power, riding the wave of the 5% growth that Frans Cronje often talks about, and nothing was done. And so by the time we got to 2008, it had started going downhill, and then it started plummeting. And I think in this instance, where we are now, we have a situation where Cyril Ramaphosa would not have acted against a guy like Gwede Mantashe if some very, very strong interests hadn't rung him and phoned him and told him that the sort of 10 megawatt option for businesses wasn't an option at all. So,
absolutely. And I was about to say, you raised the important pointer that, this was a warning that came even 10 years prior to that. I mean, if memory serves me right, Alec Irwin, who was once the public enterprises, had raised the alarm already that this is coming, and it is a freight train. That light at the end of the tunnel is a freight train, albeit it's a bit ironic that I refer to lights being at the end of the tunnel. But Phil, let me come to you. Because again, sorry to typecast you, but I do want this particular view, this particular opinion. There are municipalities in the Western Cape which have already put in place steps to free themselves from the grid, basically arguing that they're going to buy their electricity from external sources away from the ANC to stave off load shedding. If you live in Cape Town, then already you are spared level 1 or stage 1 of load shedding, because the city of Cape Town turns on its turbines and runs electricity to protect its own customers. There's a conversation, Craig, to be had about the notion of actually decentralizing power provision and allowing municipalities to buy their own power.
Well, yeah, there is, but I mean, we can almost go back before that. We must remember that with the REIPPP program, that South Africa had all of the electricity it wanted. We were oversubscribed. We have absolutely no need to have any power or load shedding at all. We had private companies offering to entirely fund electricity provision to us, and all we had to do was to agree to buy the electricity. So South Africa, for ideological reasons, in a situation where it hasn't got enough electricity for multiple years, has made the decision to not buy electricity without any money other than the cost of the thing, made the decision to not buy electricity when it's offered it to. They'd rather have load shedding than actually go down the route of buying electricity from somebody other than Eskom. I mean, what a shocking indictment is that? And picking up on Sarah's point, let's remember that in 2002, Eskom was the global utility company of the year and had a AAA credit rating. So we have gone from being the best in the world to well, I can't say we're the worst in the world, but we've fallen massively, and it's entirely ideological. And I think obviously municipalities stepping in is a stopgap solution, and that's great. And I am a fan of decentralization to a certain extent, but actually in this scenario, it's privatization that we actually need. We need to break up the network. They've already talked about it: generation, distribution, retail. They've got the solution, just like we were talking about 20, 30 years ago. They have the answer. It's ideology that stops them from doing it. It's not that we don't know what the solution is.
Absolutely. And perhaps let me segue us onto an associated issue, still keeping with Eskom. The president appears before televisions gleaming, knowing fully well that up till that point, it had only been bad news being delivered by the state. So you could tell almost immediately that he had something a little different. Sara, I'm going to look to you because I know there is a piece on the Daily Friend on this particular announcement. The announcement, of course, being that private electricity generation would be allowed up to not the 10 megawatts of power that had already been mooted by a Gwede Mantashe, but the rug being pulled under his feet too, and the president announcing 100 megawatts. Is this a significant move? Should there be a little bit of a smile that South Africans crack?
It is significant, but it's more significant for the businesses that are capable of generating their own power, and they'd essentially been in negotiations with Gwede Mantashe for 50 megawatts. So to get to 100 megawatts is like, well, sorry to be cynical, but hey guys, you wanted 50, I'm going to give you 100. But the reality is that it's power that the companies are going to use and pass any excess on to other subsidiaries or other branches. Sorry, not quite the word, but essentially it's not going to be a great deal of benefit to the consumer, the average consumer, the individual household. So it doesn't really deal with that. And that's part of what Andrew Kenny was saying in his article today, is that it's good, but it's not great. And I mean, if you think of the fright that Gwede Mantashe got when we went to load 6, and suddenly something happened, and then he got used to the idea, and nothing has really happened since then. I don't know what he's been doing, but it hasn't been helping us.
Chris, let me come to you, because there's a broader conversation here to be had, insofar as, for me, it was laughable that he made this announcement and people got as happy as they did. Because, for instance, why 100 megawatts? Why not say 4,000 megawatts, 10,000 megawatts? If you recognize that there is a crisis right now with electricity generation, why not just say 10,000 megawatts or 100,000 megawatts? Anybody can come onto the grid to provide the electricity the country sorely needs. Are we celebrating? Are we in a Stockholm syndrome here, where we celebrate our captors giving us a little bit of freedom?
The Stockholm Syndrome question sounds a bit like leading the witness. I'm not going to answer it because I think we all know. The answer when President Ramaphosa does anything, when he goes for a run on Sea Point, we all get very excited. So, I mean, if he can just do that, then we all get very excited. Look, from a technical point of view, and someone like Andrew Kenny, I would defer to his knowledge on this. But because Eskom is still in charge of the grid and distribution, they can't just allow, up to, for example, 4,000 megawatts, because if those companies switch off, it'll then just destabilize the grid and all that sort of technical stuff. The biggest issue that we should allow now, and I think it was part of the announcement, is generation off the grid. So you don't have to be connected to Eskom's grid anymore. That'll go a long way. I will also mention, and the FMF put out a statement on this, it was indicated that these generation projects will need to obtain a grid connection permit to ensure that they meet all of the requirements for grid compliance. So as Sara mentioned in the intro, there could just be government connections, government businesses that are ready to go and they get these permits. So it's not a case of this solves everything overnight. So don't worry, there are cadres ready for this.
Sadly so. And Koketso, there's that little element, that K word came out, excuse the reference, but the Amakatas, as Dumont often derides them, this elite, this political elite leech society, or layer of society rather, pardon me, that is almost always waiting to be the first in line with the begging bowl, that corporate welfare that we often see. And sometimes these rules, which to you and I sound like they're of the benefits of everybody, is actually priming them for the benefit. Should we be optimistic with this 100 megawatts provision, number one? And number two, should this be the impetus, perhaps, for the creation of a market of people who just say, we're going off the grid, and we might even supply our neighbors?
Look, I mean, call me pessimist, but that's actually my main criticism of a lot of these kind of movements. Something like allowing businesses, particularly, to generate 100 megawatts and the likes, is that these things only ever happen, like we've just mentioned, when there are cadres ready to actually participate in that space. And when cadres aren't ready to participate in that space, it's almost shot down instantly, especially by free market proponents of such moves. I mean, I'll make a similar example with, if you take the Gautrain. The Gautrain wasn't a grand idea that only came about because of the 2010 World Cup. I forget the gentleman's name, but someone did actually propose such a thing around 2003, I believe, and it was shot down instantly by government, because again, the kind of capital needed to pull this off was quite a lot. This was shot down almost instantly by government, and the moment South Africa then is awarded the 2010 World Cup, suddenly, hey, let's work on a quote-unquote high-speed rail network of some sort, which so happens to be a FIFA requirement anyway. And yeah, suddenly the Gautrain becomes a reality because, the World Cup is coming. So yeah, it's a lot of this happens all the time. It's never done for the good of people. Even if the best minds come up with an idea, it will get shot down unless cadres are, of course, willing to stand in the gap for that. There's even a story that Thabo Mbeki, during his presidency, he wanted to actually build a rail network to connect, I believe, Southern Africa, all the way from South Africa through Botswana into the DRC, etc. And Kabila at the time shot it down because he said, okay, what am I going to personally benefit from this? And there's a poor Thabo sitting there saying, this isn't for us, this is for our economies and our legacy. And there's Kabila saying, no, if I'm not going to benefit from this, so if you're not willing to pay me something to actually, to sign off on this, then don't come back. And we see a lot of the same thing here. So yeah, again, if what we're seeing with the Eskom and the 100 megawatts, I wouldn't be surprised if there are state-owned entities or cadres with contracts to provide such a thing to happen. And that's why we're hearing the president coming out delivering this good news, which is disguised as good news, but again, it's probably a funding mechanism for more of the ruling party's elite.
Absolutely. Phil, I'm going to come to you in a second, as I just remind the viewers as we head to 8:30 that this is Liberty and Friends. I'm in conversation with this week's panel as we look at the news week that was. Their names will be on screen shortly as I cycle through the comments. Keep your comments coming, guys, and please keep that engagement up. We're only sitting at 72 likes. Come on, guys, I need 50% engagement. Hit that like button. It really does get the stream out and about. Phil, I must come to you just for you to conclude this particular section before we move on to SAA, because there's a lot to talk about there too, in terms of what Koketso just raised now, the spectre of cadres being first in the queue to benefit from so-called privatization, which rightly is an imperative, a needed thing, but often it's a crony version of privatization, isn't it?
It is. It is. But I'm going to come back to just to finish off on electricity, because it's something I know a bit about, having worked in the solar industry for a few years. And one of the fascinating things is, look, whilst the 100 megawatt thing is, I just reflect or back up what the others have said. Actually, the solutions aren't there. The solutions are exactly the opposite. It's a classic case of the government doing the wrong thing. So first of all, the reason why the city of Cape Town is always one layer of load shedding less than everybody else is because it's got pumped storage. And generation isn't actually the key issue in modern electricity grid. Storage is the future. We know we can have unlimited virtually renewable energy from South Africa, which is in zone 5, zone 6 of the zones. But somehow we have to switch that generation, which is basically during the day mainly, or early morning and evening for wind, and finding a way of storing it. So the city of Cape Town obviously has a Steenbras dam, and it pumps water up to the top of the dam when it's got excess power, and it releases the water to have a peak. And actually, in a modern grid, we need to be creating, and I quoted on a project a few years ago for Drakensberg municipality to do exactly the same thing. So actually, and then if you look at models like in the States, you've got Sun City, which was Elon Musk's project. Now, Elon Musk's project wasn't vast 100 megawatt fields of electricity in the thing. It was hundreds, tens and hundreds of thousands of residential homes with every single home where they were renting people's roofs and putting solar systems on the roof. The homeowner gets a bit of power, and they use people's roofs to generate electricity, but you just need the storage system. So there are so many of these options that are available, and the government is just doing all the wrong things at all the wrong time. And we can even look back to the we had all of that drive for solar geysers, solar energy in terms of thermal, and the government completely screwed that up. I worked for 3 years as a consultant for a company in that, building up a business in that industry for the government to pull a rug on for the whole thing overnight and destroyed an entire industry literally just by doing that, and didn't care less. And that is just it's actually criminal with electricity. It's not my specialized thing, but I find it so infuriating because it's so absolutely solvable. More than almost any other problem I can think of, it's solvable.
Absolutely. There is no other way of putting it, Chris, except how you just did, rather succinctly. With that being said, let me move us on. Let me move us on just to keep us cooking with grease here. And unfortunately, I'll move us on to another state-owned enterprise which made the news headlines this week. Sara, I'm going to look to you just to open us up on this. But the South African Airways pomp and ceremony is announced to have sold 51% of its shares or ownership to a consortium, Ramaphosa tells us, of private individuals. But then, sure enough, the news comes out that these so-called private individuals sure do seem like the kind of people who benefit always from state largesse and state projects.
Well, I'll tell you what was most striking was the 51% sale, because that has been Pravin Gordhan's mantra, that the government would always be the majority shareholder in SAA. And the predictable happened. Nothing. No one came forward to take up 49%, meaning with the government still being in charge, being the majority shareholder. So the very fact that it moved on that meant that the consortium, I presume, persuaded Pravin that nothing was going to happen unless they gave up majority ownership. So that in itself is like a big day for capitalism. I haven't caught up on all the details because I've been away for a week, so I'm sort of going through gazillion emails and articles.
Sure.
But probably the only thing, and my colleagues here can probably help me out on this, but certainly having someone like Gidon Novick involved at least is a man who knows about airlines. And that has to mean something. I mean, he was Kalula. He's got lift on the pun off the ground. So the others I've seen reference to, but I don't know enough about to comment any more wisely. But at least somebody knows about airplanes.
Well, to that particular point, I just put up Vernon Niger's comment on here, who says, and Chris, I'm going to throw it to you and the broader implication around it. But SAA has basically sold to Hattingh that is funded by the PIC. The PIC, of course, is the Public Investment Corporation, a state entity that handles the pensions of government employees, and also a former deputy finance minister, and Popo Molefe's names come up. So if the PIC is funding it, it really means it's not really privatized now, is it, Chris?
No, I don't think so. I would have loved to point all of you to an article that the Rational Standard broke, the news that we broke over at Rational Standard on Friday, where we sort of connected some of these links. But unfortunately, the website is being upgraded this evening, so I can't tell you when the website will be fully up again, hopefully in the next few days. So keep an eye out for that. But yeah, in a nutshell, there's a few high-level ANC sort of relationships and connections being floated around. So it appears on the surface to be an element of privatization, but indeed, if it's funded by the PIC, can one really consider it in that vein? I think it's great that there's some aviation expertise at the very least. I mean, Lord knows the SAA board in the past hasn't had any of that, so it might go some way. I think it does indicate also that if Ethiopian nor Emirates Airlines came in, it shows you that the state is still very adamant about controlling as much, about having as much control as it can. I thought one of those would come in. They're the big players on the continent and indeed the Middle East. They have much stronger networks. I thought they would bring some of the older planes into the SAA network, maybe take some of our A350s and some of those models off our hands and maintain them, because SAA Technical is also in a bad state. So it shows you that, yes, Minister Gordon, I mean, yeah, I've struggled to see ideologically that he would be giving up control in practice. He might say it. They want to send the right signals to the markets. The commodity cycle is up, so they want to take advantage of that, a stronger rand. So now they're sending the quote-unquote right signals. We'll see in time what it actually comes to. I'm sure in the next 5 or 10 years, there will still be another bailout. And I will mention with SAA and Eskom, because we're not really seeing the deep reforms that we need, the state can then turn around in 20 years and say, look, we tried free markets, we tried reform, we tried privatization, it doesn't work.
Yeah, that was my my cynicism was born out of that that likelihood that would be the approach they take. Phil, I'm going to come to you and then Koketso, because we've reached a point now where South Africans are just absolutely hurtful or absolutely fed up with the constant bailing out of these organizations. It seems, if you're the kind of person who is dependent on the state for whatever reason, but if you're the kind of person who's dependent on the state, it seems it'll be a slap in your face too, that the begging bowl, when it comes out from Eskom or SAA, is filled to the brim with billions of rands. But in reality, for you, the ordinary citizen, again, I'm making the case here for someone who would see themselves as being dependent on the state. The begging bowl, if it comes out from you, the poor individual, is almost pittance.
But sure. Sorry, Phil. I was just going to mention, do you think, I mean, and this is a question to all of you, but are we really seeing that level of hurtfulness? I mean, I wish that I could see it, but I'm wondering if at the end of the day, we've got local elections coming up and we're just going to vote for parties who promise us different things. So I'd also like someone to maybe assuage my doubts on that point. Sorry, Phil.
Well, no, Phil, maybe chip in there, Phil.
Yeah, well, look, to be honest, when I knew we were going to talk about this subject, which isn't what I know a lot about, I only wrote down one thing on a piece of paper, which was who's going to fund the losses. Then we'll find out who owns the company. We don't think that SAA is about to make a profit overnight, and that'll tell us all we need to know quite quickly.
Absolutely. Well, maybe Koketso, that question that Chris was putting up, again, it's almost this notion in economics of the moral hazard, isn't it? It's this idea that those who take decisions and don't pay the consequences of which will always take those decisions because, again, the costs are borne by someone else, or they can shoved onto someone else. And Phil raises that particular point when it comes to Eskom. Who will bear the cost of any bad decisions that are then taken in the management structures of this new SAA?
Yeah, I'm a personal believer that failure actually shouldn't be rewarded. This goes right in line with, free market principles. If your business is failing, then it's actually for the better that the business fails. The shareholders actually learn their lesson and they apply that in their next business venture, or for the better. We don't see that with SOEs. And when it comes to SAA specifically, probably to add on to what Phil was saying, not just about who's bearing the brunt of the losses here, but all things considered, we've got planes in the air, but I don't believe any of them are actually South African Airways or, have the South African Airways tail on them. So you've got an airline that actually hasn't been flying. I don't know what kind of maintenance has been done on the aircraft themselves as well. I have two very close friends who are still to be paid by, I believe, SAA itself and SA Express, dating back to March and April last year already. Details about this sort of thing were actually very scarce. So maybe I should actually have a look at that Rational Standard article. I don't know if any of that is covered. But details around the sale are actually very scarce. What we do know, however, is that there are definitely cadres in there. I actually tweeted this on Friday, and lo and behold, Jonathan Witt had already done some mini analysis where he exposed some of the shareholders in there. The names pop up in there. Muleketi pops up, who's married to Fraser Muleketi, the same Fraser who's a sister to Arthur Fraser, who then comes out quite a bit in Jack Poe's book. And again, it screams that there's a web of cadeonomics here. And this is being done all under the ruse of privatization, and we know that it's not. I mean, I didn't know that there's actually PIC money involved in here. But again, if there is, that means people sitting on the board do have some semblance of proximity to Lutuli House. And that means that they can't actually make the decisions that need to be done for the benefit of everyone, or for the benefit of all the shareholders, of which, after the sale has gone through, 49% of it is still yours and mine's taxes. So businesses that fail should be allowed to fail. But in the state of SAA, even the new SAA with 51% quote unquote private equity, I don't think it'll be allowed to fail, simply because the people right at the top in the corner office are the same people who have, the NC's top 6 on speed dial.
Yeah, the cadre must always get his cut, as I always say. Guys, I must move us on, and move us on to a rather interesting topic, one which, Phil, you've probably been brimming to get into and start chewing on. The Democratic Alliance, the party that runs quite a few municipalities across the country, and of course, more prominently, the Western Cape province, issues out a press release this week, basically saying, hey, we're looking to give, they've proposed a bill in Parliament, a new law in Parliament that they're proposing to give premiers the power to be able to call a referendum. Phil, do you want to maybe take us through what they're basically proposing, and of course, your thoughts on it?
Sure. Okay. So basically, there's been an issue, and just for the context, there's been an issue since 1996. This issue's existed. So since 1996, there's been a disparity between the Western Cape Constitution, the National Constitution, and the enabling legislation being the Referendums Act. So the Referendums Act was last updated in 1992 and only allowed for the president to call a referendum. But the Western Cape Constitution and the National Constitution both allowed for a premier to call a provincial referendum and the president a national referendum. And for 25 years, that issue has gone unresolved. and thankfully the DA have now decided to resolve the referendum issue, and to empower the premiers. I mean, there's an interesting bit of politics in there. If you look at the DA's press release, they don't actually mention the Western Cape Constitution at all. They only give reference to the national constitution. They ignore the Western Cape Constitution, presumably because they don't want this to get tied to Cape independence. But of course, the only premier they've actually got is in the Western Cape, and it is in the Western Cape Constitution. So there's absolutely no doubt that this is about calling referendums in the Western Cape. And in fact, Helen Zille was on record about 3 weeks ago saying they're going to call referendums in the Western Cape. So this is the first step in clearing the way for the DA to call referendums in the Western Cape. And of course, that absolutely warms the cockles of my heart. And the fact that it's taken 25 years to get here tells you that the DA aren't doing this because they've always had this on their to-do list and never quite got around to it. This is a sign of the political times in the Western Cape, and this is a response to the pressures that are building, both from the independence movement, which is now becoming very, very visible, and also, I believe, particularly from the coloured vote, which is starting to move away from the DA. And I think you've always had this situation where the DA has been in a box of its own making. You know, it's been very fixed in terms of we want to be able to fix these problems. We know what we must do, but actually we're not allowed to do it because the ANC ties our hands behind our back. And obviously, after 3 terms of government in the Western Cape, the people of the Western Cape are starting to say, well, look, we don't really care what the Constitution says or the ANC. So either you're the people that can fix this or you can't. We're not going to have another term of excuses of why you couldn't fix the problems that you know exist. So I think this is really a good example of people power, that has driven the DA to this, and this is the start, not the end. This clearly is not an isolated incident. This is something. Look, that there's been a lot of discussions between the independence groups and the political parties. So I know more than I can say, but this hasn't just happened, and this is everything you think this should be. If you think this is the DA clearing the decks because they're going to be calling referendums in the Western Cape and taking the fight to the ANC, then you've called it exactly right. That's exactly their plan. We might not all agree on what that fight's going to be, but I think there's an agreement that we can rub out those lines, and whether it's federal autonomy or it's de facto independence or it's greater autonomy or it's outright independence, there is now a dominant political philosophy of the DA, the Freedom Front, the Cape Party, probably some other parties too. AfriForum, who've opened their branch in the Western Cape in the last month and a half, the independence groups, Cape Exit, everybody's saying, look, you know what? Actually, enough's enough. The ANC are never going to solve this out, and it's down to the people of the Western Cape, and actually where that line falls, and whether we end up at independence or confederalism. Federalism isn't going to cut it, but confederalism, or what the ultimate solution is, or how South Africa breaks up, remains to be seen. But actually, this has set the DA absolutely on collision course. This is decentralization against centralization, and this is the first blow in a battle that's going to get gloriously messy, and obviously we're absolutely delighted about it. It's long overdue.
Well, a mouthful there, but let me stay with you, Phil, for a moment, because I know this is the very thing that you're pushing for quite aggressively. The organization that you run, the Cape Independence Advocacy, pardon me, group. Where are your numbers now? I know you guys have been trying to raise. I'm tempted to call it a petition, but where are your numbers now?
No, so actually we don't do that. So interesting enough that the group that's trying to do that would be Cape Exit, although we work quite closely with them. We're very much a political lobby group. So our focus is on primarily is on keeping independence in the narrative. So a lot of media stuff, and then a lot of behind the scenes political negotiations and trying to influence parties and people towards independence. So that's very much our thing. So we have a bit of a public face, but most of our work is done in the shadows. Cape Exit is the organization that's collecting mandates, and they're at about 825, 830,000 at the moment. And for context, look, and I think they say 92% of those are in the Western Cape. So let's say, broadly speaking, there's somewhere between 750,000 and 800,000 people in the Western Cape who've signed up for independence. And to put that in context, the DA's got 1.14 million voters. So probably within the next 6 months, there'll be more people signed up for independence than voted for the DA in the Western Cape.
Oh, how's that for a stat for you? Koketso, I'm going to move to you because, I think Phil has said it all, which is it's very difficult to try and think of posing questions to anybody else here. But, Phil makes an important point, though, around the importance of political pressure, sustained political pressure, which is unyielding, unflinching in its vehemence towards a political party, whether it's the DA or the ANC or whatever the case may be. The importance of the political pressure in bringing about a change. Phil advocates for one such idea. Surely other South Africans can replicate this in other areas of issues that we care about. You're muted. No, forget.
There we go.
Welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah, I was just saying that the whole thing with not just secession, but the whole referendum, this is fascinating stuff. Now, I'm Joburg thick and through. I'm sure you guys have, you know that by now. It's all in the accent, of course. But yeah, this is fascinating stuff. But I just want to bring up the point here, Sihle, what you were saying about the consistency. What I love about this is that this isn't actually tied to a single event or even a single individual or anything like that. There's no moment where people have decided that, you know what, we need to actually step away and call for a referendum, which is, for me, I like it because it means that the idea can actually exist in and of itself. But probably, even as a question to you, Phil, what is the actual implication of, if the DA and the Cape Independence Advocacy Group actually has their way? I'm bringing this to attention because we all know that the Zulu kingdom is quite numerous. When you factor in the Ingonyama Trust as well, there's quite a bit that can be there's quite a bit that actually can be said there just on that. But again, is this not setting an example where the Republic of South Africa can eventually end up being federalized to a point where tribalism can start to seep in here, where you've got the Cape people seeing themselves as effectively not just their own nation, but probably even from a racial tone here, seeing themselves as a separate people entirely. So are we not maybe surfing dangerous waters here? I'm trying to be the devil's advocate here. And what kind of example really can talk of a referendum actually set out for the rest of the country? I'd love to see it happen, but again, it is quite a risk because again, when you know this more than anyone here, that when you bring up certain things, your actual motive or objectives is put to the side, and people attack the individual and not the idea. So yeah, maybe that's my one question to say, what kind of example is this setting to the rest of the country? And do you expect everyone else in South Africa to follow suit?
Well, so yeah, look, an interesting one. We're certainly you can't, you have to imagine we have fairly thick skins. So, but that's fine. At the end of the day, a lot of people start off against this. There was a fantastic tweet that almost went viral from somebody on Twitter this week that kind of said, I used to think Cape Independence was absolutely crazy when I first heard about it, but now I realise it's the only solution, and that is so many people's journey. So South Africa could have worked. Perhaps South Africa could have worked as a united country with our 11 languages and our vast land mass. But it hasn't. That's the reality. We all know we're talking about a failed state. None of us think it's about to be solved in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Salvation isn't around the corner. So the question is, what do we do? There's not an option to do nothing, and we can't be romantic about it. And bottom line is, South Africa is about the size of Western Europe, or half of Western Europe, and to break up into smaller, more manageable countries where the sort of ideologies of the region are better reflected would arguably be a far better arrangement than the current arrangement we've got, where we're all at each other's throats, and we've got a dominant political force in the centre, and then people outside who just really aren't happy. And the most scary statistic in the Western Cape is, and this is a statistic I've checked myself, if not a single voter ever had voted for the ANC. So since 1996, if nobody in the Western Cape had ever voted for the ANC, the Western Cape would still have had an ANC government for 27 years. The people of the Western Cape are utterly powerless. They've got no democratic mandate whatsoever. We don't have functional democracy. We've never voted the government in. We can't vote it out. We can't resist affirmative action. We can't resist EWC. We have absolutely no power. So, I accept that there can end up being tribal spin-offs, and that's unfortunate, and I guess that's something that has to be managed. But I mean, as an organisation, we're civic nationalists. Our primary division is an ideological one, which says we don't get the government we vote for. And we've never got the government we voted for, a minority government at one point. We don't get the government we vote for. The majority of Western Cape citizens have never had the government they vote for, and there's no reasonable prospect that they'll ever get the government that they vote for. So, I mean, that just isn't a situation that's tenable for people in the Western Cape or in any other country. And I wouldn't expect that of Zulus or Vendors or Tswanis or anybody else. You have to have some skin in the game. And if you haven't got some skin in the game, you've got to change the game.
And maybe to that end, I'm going to bring you in, Sara and Chris, in a moment. Chris, let me come to you first because, personally, I listen to Phil, and I totally get the rationale for this. I totally get the reasoning for this. My ideal, for instance, would be a much more federal South Africa where each region controls itself. And yes, you might still have some national government, but really it should be a fraction of the size of what it is now. And really decision making should be as local as possible and geared towards as much freedoms for people as possible. That'll be my particular ideal. But there's definitely many iterations that this can take. But there is an argument to be made that something, as Phil presents it, is erring on the side of liberty. Or am I being naive in this regard?
No, look, I think it depends on the context of a country, its history, its current sort of composition, how it might shake out. I think there's no guarantee that sort of the diffusion of power or localization results in more liberty. I mean, that's my only sort of hedge, I guess. The tyrant down the street might be a lot more effective than the tyrant sitting in Pretoria or Bloemfontein, for example. The one in Pretoria and Bloemfontein is occupied a lot more with national stuff, and they leave me alone. I always say I'm much more worried about an efficient communist in government than an incompetent communist, which luckily we've had until this point to some extent. So it depends how it shakes out. Whatever system happens to take the day, as long as it prioritizes and is founded on liberal ideals that promote individual liberty, I'll be fully in favor of that.
Absolutely. To that particular end, that would be my vision, for example. So I'm going to bring you in here with a little bit of cheek. But that'll be my particular vision, for instance, of a free KwaZulu-Natal. When the new king was ordained and placed on the throne, for me in particular, there was an air of optimism because now we have a new, young, fresh, really modern leader who could be persuaded, if you will. If the new prime minister of the Zulu nation is exactly as Chris described, an individual who's liberal-minded, really classically liberal-minded, if anything, you could find yourself in a situation where a major population group in this country with a historical homeland, if you will, that is KwaZulu-Natal, the eternal homeland of the Zulus, us Zulus. Oh, look at that. I'm even beaming with a smile as I say this. But, you could find yourself in a situation where Zulus openly say, look, not on the basis of us being Zulus, but rather on the basis of us as a nation looking to have greater autonomy, greater freedoms. We want to go in a particular ideological direction, a freedom-orientated ideological direction, and our come to the issue of the Ingonyama Trust, because I think that's also part of this conversation. In fact, we'll move on to that in a moment. But Sara, your thoughts just overall on this conversation?
Yeah, I'm probably a little more with Koketso on this than with Phil or Chris, because I absolutely have no qualms with devolving power further down the line, everywhere and anywhere in South Africa. But for me, the problem is that you know, if you get a KZN, let's say you get a seceded KZN, you get a seceded Western Cape, the rest of the country will be a disaster. The rest of the country will still be a disaster, and because I don't think it's a question of tribal issues. I think you are going to be surrounded by seas of if poverty can get any worse, of seas of poverty, and they are going to put pressure on the Eastern Cape, the Northwest. I mean, those Limpopo, Limpopo, not so much. Actually, I have fairly good things to say about Limpopo, but Mpumalanga, absolute disasters. And unless there is some strength in the center to alleviate the problems there, I think people are going to feel very. I'm very concerned that certainly seceding will. It's literally going to end up having problems on borders. I'm a little more reticent about it. Also, the thing about both, but particularly the Western Cape, is the structure of the whole society there is the makeup of the society is different, and that tells as well. I mean, I have to be honest. I'm not quite sure where Cape Independence would have been if Nomainde and Koketso had been there for much longer. I mean, she took Cape Town on a downward slope very, very quickly. In all fairness, DA imperfect as it is, you know, let's be honest. I don't think anyone would be even thinking about independence if the Western Cape had not been properly run. And you know, the uptowners of us have all lived in places that have not been properly run for 27 years. So maybe call it secessionist envy or something of that ilk. But I think I don't quite go with the idea of how the Western Europe is, or Europe can be identified into essentially nationalities. And I think that's probably the problem, is what happens to the South African nationality. I just think economically, I don't know the ins and outs of the economics of it at all. But I would be a little bit worried for the successful independent areas that the unsuccessful will become pressure points.
Phil, let me throw it back to you. Again, maybe as I even do that, I must add this particular point. South Africans we're not alien to the notion of going it alone and being independent. We do it almost on a day-to-day basis. If you live in a gated community and a state of sorts, to an extent, you've opted to go it alone, to buttress yourself away from the failures of maybe a local municipality or a metro that has collapsed around you. You know, if you look at some of these gated communities, they're becoming more sophisticated. Some of them have hospitals, malls, recreational areas, you name it. As people
soon to be city.
Well, there you go. There you go. So, you know, people building that enclave society, as France Premier, for example, calls it, as the one possible outcome of a South Africa. Let me throw it to you, Phil. But before I do that, I must pay homage to the fans. Guys, welcome to it. It's 9 o'clock. It's just at 9 o'clock. You're watching Liberty and Friends. This is your premier news, weekly news ending show. I'm in conversation with Koketso Resane, who's 1/3 of the Manpatria podcast. Sara, the chief editor of the Daily Friend publication. That's www.dailyfriend.co.za. Chris Hattingh from the Free Market Foundation. Shout out to you guys at the FMF. And of course, Phil Craig, Big Phil, from the Cape Advocacy, Cape Independence Advocacy Group, pardon me. And that's exactly who I was about to segue to. Phil, close it for us, please, because technically you opened this conversation up for us based on the press release, of course, by the DA, that it would be seeking to pass a law that allows premiers to be able to call referendums. But bring it to us, having heard all of the arguments, your closing statements on this particular point before I move us on.
Sure. Well, look, so ironically, I probably would agree with a lot of what Sarah said. I would just have it in a different context. So I would absolutely agree with her that and actually John Steenhuisen has publicly made much the same point, which is the only reason you want Cape independence is because the DA have run the Western Cape so much better. And actually, when we addressed the press club, it was a point we particularly specifically addressed. We absolutely agree that is the case. And I think the only point that we made back there, and John was kind of saying, look, you know what, actually, we can save the whole country. And our argument back was, but actually, the only reason you were able to save the Western Cape was because we were able, as the electorate, to elect you. So actually, there's a two-way street. So effectively, it doesn't help much that you could save all of South Africa if South Africa doesn't want you. So from a Western Cape perspective, we have to save ourselves. We have to save something, and then you hope that from that you can have a rebuilding process. But that first and foremost, the people of the Western Cape are responsible to the people of the Western Cape, and the rest of South Africa wants to vote itself into oblivion. The people of the Western Cape can't be held responsible for their own suicide at the ballot box, which is what's happening.
Absolutely, and I totally take your point. I'm just laughing at the comment I put on screen. Corona is boring. Maybe we should treat our president like the French treat theirs. A funny joke this week, if you saw the video, an ordinary citizen in France basically asked the president the following: what did the 5 fingers say to the face? So if you want to see what the answer was to that, just look up a video of Macron this week. Guys, on that little slightly humorous note, let me move us on, please, to another issue. As I go to my notes, pardon me. And yes, actually, the Ingonyama Trust. This week, a landmark ruling by the Pietermaritzburg High Court. Basically, there's quite a few components in it, but the thrust of it was to question the practice by the trust. The Ingonyama Trust, of course, a trust that the king is the custodian of, or the sole trustee of, that has just about over 59% or so of KZN land, and it's held in communal trust. The court's basically saying, hey, this trust, we're not really feeling it insofar as it charging rent. Pardon me. That kombucha came back. Basically saying, we're not feeling it, this notion of it charging people rent, and that's been declared illegal or unconstitutional. And if anything, it demands that those rent monies be paid back. And of course, there are other provisions. Sarah, I'm going to look to you. I'm hoping you may have kept abreast on this issue. The other component, of course, was who brought this particular court case forward. A group of ladies who took exception to some of the provisions. And again, it's not all of the trust, as has been reported, but there are some traditional leaders who will argue, for instance, that property rights follow the male line of the family, and women are excluded from that. So they took that provision to court and also won on that particular element. Sara, the question I'll pose to you is as follows, and I'll pose to everybody. There is definitely a need. Okay, I'm framing this question from bias, so let me be neutral. The Ingonyama Trust simply isn't, it really isn't a mechanism, though, that should be maintained in a 21st century South Africa. There's a desperate need, for reform of this institution, isn't there?
I think there is. I mean, let's remember that it came about in the last, in the dying days of apartheid. And as I recall, it was sort of part of the deal to get Mangosuthu Buthelezi on board into the negotiation process. But to me, what's interesting about these elements of it, One is it's been patently unfair from day one. It was, I think, from a leadership point of view, it was a mistake. It was a mistake that had to ultimately unravel. The other thing is that by giving the women the rights that otherwise accorded only to men is a way, I think, of dealing with marrying a modern constitutional democracy to a traditional society element. So you don't do away with something. It doesn't become one thing instead of another thing. It becomes one thing empowering another, but the structure, the communal structure stays in place. So that's probably the sort of the overall compromise one's essentially now seeing from this. I'd like to just take on a slightly different tack. Is I saw a number of editorials saying that, making the point about how important it was for individuals to have the rights to land, and for people who were entitled or should be entitled to title deeds to have title deeds, and you didn't want to see an urban-rural divide on that. What worries me is that it's great that the editors are saying this, but it seems to suggest that they are not absolutely up to where things are in the expropriation without compensation debate. And the very fact that in the reality, custodianship is being looked at very, very seriously, it suggests that they're not aware that land ownership, title deeds, urban or rural, are not on the government's agenda. So while this does empower in this particular circumstance, and it's big because it is more than half of the land of KZN, and I think it does offer a great opportunity for a dynamic new king to really get in touch with his own subjects. I think it's shown to some extent the aspects of greeting it with a positive spin. It shows that actually the land debate the media might have been lagging considerably behind on what's actually happening in the land debate.
Absolutely, and let me bring it in, Koketso, then I'll come to you, Chris. Koketso, there's a conversation to be had here, and let me just, for clarity's sake, mention exactly what was struck as being unconstitutional. So basically, in 2012, the then chairperson of the ITB, or the Ingonyama Trust, one Jerome Gwenya, morphed the Ingonyama Trust from it dishing out what's called PTOS, or permission to occupy. Now, let me give a bit of context. I myself have a farm in KZN, multiple farms in KZN, to which I have, or my family at least, have a PTO, because the land has been, so basically a PTO recognized ownership from generations past. So for example, the Ngobese plot has been in my family for 4 or 5 generations that we can think back, and we got a PTO. So in place of a title deed, you get this piece of paper that gives you permission to occupy this land. So he morphed it from that system to one where residents were then expected to pay a yearly lease on the land of about 800 Rand and upwards, which for a lot of people, by the way, is a steep amount of money, given the poverty in a lot of the parts of the Ingonyama Trust. So that's the element which was considered and called unconstitutional, and those monies demanded that they be paid back. The Minister of Land Affairs, I know that's not the department, but I'll just call it Land Affairs because it's a long title, has been given 3 months to basically rectify this particular situation. So I just thought I should bring this out for clarity's sake, for those who might be wondering what we're actually talking about here. But let me come to you, Koketso, because, I did mention at the beginning of this, I've got a bias, guys. I've got a bias on this issue. I'm not going to pretend as if I'm neutral. I'm never neutral anyway. But I've got a bias because KZN, under the Ingonyama Trust, that's my homeland. That's how we've been given property rights. And I've argued, of course, that there is a need for reform. Sara rightly mentions, for example, that strengthens the property rights. But it seemed for me, and I don't know what your take is, that this should be the opportunity, therefore, for someone to have the ear of the new king and say, King, it might be time for us to strengthen the Ingonyama Trust as an institution, professionalize it, that's what I mean by strengthen it, where it becomes a body that actually accords title ownership to the residents who live underneath it and administers that as part of the trust. Your thoughts, please, on this topic.
So basically, at least to my knowledge, nowhere else in the country does something similar to this actually happen. So my own parents, they've actually built out, quote unquote, they've built our family home, aka retirement home in the village and everything. And there's no yearly lease on that. And again, compared to suburban standards, it's quite a big piece of land. I'm sure everyone knows this. What you get in a rural area is multiples of what you can get in town. So yeah, nowhere else does this happen in the country, to my knowledge. So I'm going to side with the court on this one because, again, this is very bizarre. I wasn't aware until this case actually popped up that people were paying a yearly figure here to sit on land that's been in their family for X amount of generations. But like Sarah mentioned, if you paint this with the paintbrush of even expropriation without compensation, the behavior almost of definitely residents on Ingonyama Trust land, it's a non-factor for them. And for me, that tells me that there is kind of a national, I'd call it a national understanding that expropriation without compensation won't happen to the degree that the ruling party is actually resolved at their elective conference, where the economic freedom fighters, oxymoronic as their name is, people don't actually share that view, and they don't behave in a manner that suggests that it's going to happen. So yeah, for me, because this doesn't happen, at least to my knowledge, anywhere else in the country, I'm going to go with the court on this one and say, you know what, no, let's scrap this. There are other ways for the royal family to generate an income. Again, even if they limit it to maybe not for residential purposes or for small holding or subsistence farming, but if we think of all that land that Tonga Hewlett consumes for their farming, perhaps there can be commercial agreements there, but exempt the normal person, exempt the family man who's literally just trying to eke out a living on the same land where his father was and his father's father and the likes. The other issue, of course, is the whole the rights issue, particularly with I didn't know that the court case was brought forward by a woman, but again, I don't expect this to go anywhere, because remember when Tate Gedletlekisa was president, he famously said in Parliament that some African issues need to be solved by the Tribal Council, and then the whole debate of yes, but you are a citizen of the Republic of South Africa and everyone is equal before the Constitution, right? And Jacob didn't know how to answer that. Again, our media didn't really follow up on that. But again, by tribal law, it is a patriarchal system. You could argue it is very sexist, particularly when there's crimes committed against women. So yeah, that is probably going to remain in place for the foreseeable future. I don't think there's a large voice or a majority that actually wants to change the status quo. But when it comes to land use and land rights, I'm going to go with the courts on this one.
On this particular issue, Chris, as I said, I'm going to come to you, and then Phil, I'll end off with you. Guys, we're in the last 15 minutes of the show. You're watching Liberty and Friends. We're cooking with grease with my guests. We have two more issues that we're going to chew on. So I'm going to ask us to please be brief. But Chris, I'm going to move us to the sort of reforms we want to see. We've been talking about the issue and setting the case here, but the sort of reforms we want to see. Let me throw something to you because I have a vested interest on this issue. In 2012, the former Zulu king, who's just passed on, had actually already begun to say, you know what, I fully agree with the notion of modernizing the Ingonyama Trust. It can't remain this way, and secure title deed he is firmly in favor of. Let me be precise and specific. A lot of the townships that were in KZN, used to be Ingonyama Trust land, which was given by the king to ordinary people to be able to own with title deeds. So, for example, the family home in Mlazi, my township, as I said, the old title deed of the home still has Ingonyama Trust on it, but basically it's an actual title deed that's been passed down, therefore, from my grandfather to my mother, and of course to me, when both of those people passed on. So there's definitely a culture of land ownership through secure title in KwaZulu. So I want to just dispel the myth immediately, because I've often seen in the media people say, oh, it's like feudalism, blah, blah, blah. You know, people work on the king's land and blah, 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 blah. That's not true. So let me fast forward to 2012. 2012, the king, I forget what he was talking, basically says, look, there's need for reform. I want to be met halfway on this issue because I'm skeptical of Pretoria taking over land. There was already talks back then, if you remember, Malema, who had just come from the ANC Youth League, about nationalizing land. So that's where the skepticism came from, of allowing Pretoria to govern things. But he basically says, look, I'd love to be met halfway, and this is the proposed solution, and it's one I hope the new king takes on. And to speak to what Koketso even mentioned, if a family plot like ours, I have 55 hectares on one piece of land, where the family home is, a portion of it can be taken off grid. You can fence it off. Let's call it 10 hectares. That comes with a title deed. And then the rest of the 40 hectares stays a PTO, a permission to occupy, but comes with a 99-year lease, in inverted commas. You pay nothing, but it's a 99-year secure lease, cannot be changed other than in a court of law. Would that be the kind of compromise, a move towards secure title that we should see? Because I can tell you now, if there's a conversation about wholly removing the Zulu king from ownership of this thing, I don't think it would work. So what do you think in light of this? And hey, you might just say, fudge it. The whole thing needs to go into private ownership. And that would be one argument. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with it, but your thoughts on this issue?
Look, I think the way you've so eloquently described it points to why we should always have people who are actually on the ground and have the history with different contexts, why you should have them applying the principles to the different contexts. So you can have the principled academic discussion about the theory and the classical principles and property rights and individualism, that kind of thing. How does this shake out on the ground? How do you take in consideration how the history of KwaZulu-Natal came about, what has happened in the past, what's happened in the last 5, 10, 20 years, etc., etc. So I think you're exactly right to point that out. As much as I want, for example, SAA and Eskom to be sold off overnight, we're not going to get there overnight. It needs to be a gradual process. And the same with title deeds and property rights. It's a gradual process. I will say, of course, now with the new sort of revised talk around the amendment bill, the courts won't have nearly as strong a role as the ANC and the EFF. They don't want the courts to have such a strong role in terms of arbitration and deciding on these things. So you're going to have these title deeds, and the courts are going to say, okay, you've got your 99-year lease, we're going to get EWC, and then all of that falls away. So all of our talk around structural reform, around economic growth, all of that goes out the window if we go with EWC. So that's the meta thing, I guess, hanging over the South African economy's head, unfortunately. But yeah, I think what you've pointed out is exactly the sort of application of principles that one should follow. Are you muted?
Your turn.
Right, I'm back. There we go. Phil, I'm going to end this segment off with you. Again, we've traversed a few issues here, but really, this is a property rights issue, and it is one which speaks to the definite need for people to be able to own their piece of Africa so that it opens up further opportunity for them. I'm definitely not opposed to that, but there's also a conversation to be had, and sorry to typecast you, but there is a conversation to be had on this issue regarding a potential Zulu nation which may want to, in the future, to secede. A skepticism, a healthy skepticism that it's always had to national government controlling Zululand.
Yeah, look, to be honest, I found this a very interesting conversation because I've learned an awful lot. It's not something I've known much about. Yeah, it's been interesting, and I think my instinct is naturally, as somebody who's a free market sort of person. I'm drawn to property rights, and that would be my default position. But I also am, really somebody who thinks we have to respect culture to an extent too, and therefore it's a difficult balance, and it certainly isn't. So for me, in many ways, I would be wary of. I wouldn't know enough anyway, but I think there has to be a balance between, and ultimately the Zulu people themselves must lead this discussion. And being a Brit, I've kind of been through this in a different context. The British royal families had to go through much the same process, or not the same process, but certainly the sort of the whole funding issue and tax paying, and how do you stay relevant in a world that's changing, from a sort of an absolute monarchy into what becomes a completely symbolic role, and I think broadly speaking, the British royal family did that very well, and have remained popular, and you would hope that something similar will happen with the Zulu nation, but ultimately they're going to have to drive that themselves, and if they feel that their identity is best served as an independent country, that's great by me, and if they feel their identity is best served as part of a greater collective, then great. And ironically, my suspicion anyway for South Africa is that we're probably going to end up in some kind of confederal system rather than federal or independence, which perhaps is the compromise that may well work best for everybody. But whether that then is South Africa, which of course is only 110 years old, or whether actually that's an SADC or remains to be seen. So yeah, but I mean, who knows?
Absolutely, guys, we are really running out of time. I'm going to ask us to breeze past this issue. Please polish up. There's a clue in that. Polish up on your comments and nail your opinion to the mast, because the new acting Minister of Health, pardon me as I try and find her name. Oh goodness me, Mama Logo kubayi-ngubane. The infamous picture of her during the I think it was the hearings into Jacob Zuma in Parliament, painting her nails in disinterest, of course, as to what the MPs were saying. That person has been made the acting Minister of Health by yours truly, Cyril Matamela Ramaphosa. A sign of great confidence in our COVID response. Sara, very briefly. You're muted, Sara.
Right. I was thinking that her name has probably 5 times as many syllables as mine and 6 times as many as Phil's. She is also, I mean, she looks, sorry, pardon my Jewish pun, but she really does look like a kugel. She's our Minister of Tourism and whatnot. And I mean, they've said that she's a great, they've been saying in the papers, she's a great tourism minister. Well, I mean, if you look at it from the point of view of non-racialism, I wouldn't exactly have said so. But what's really concerning is that clearly that being a deputy minister doesn't mean you become the acting minister, because there is a deputy minister of health who has a medical degree and experience. Whether he's good or not, I don't know at all. But, I would have thought that you really, even medical or not, and preferably medical in the current crisis, you have someone with heft. And with all due respect to the lady, she doesn't have the heft. So I'm not quite sure what the hell Ramaphosa was thinking about in this portfolio at this time. I mean, heavens above.
And let me just bring everybody in. And, as we're considering this, I know she's going to become a bit of a butt of the joke here. But, maybe as we wrap up the show, I just want us to cover the other issue that we've brought up here, along with this acting minister. Koketso, let me come to you, because you had mentioned Gift of the Givers. I don't know what headline you had seen this week. And maybe as you mentioned them, don't worry, guys, I'll give everybody an opportunity to comment and have a last word. As I drive in throughout the Eastern Cape, shooting for the piloting of the Mazakele campaign, you see Gift of the Givers signs everywhere in this part of the world, especially in these failed municipalities where there's been a complete failure, for example, for water provisions. They're drilling boreholes across this part of the world, passing out food parcels, you name it. To a lot of people, when you talk about them, they're a godsend.
Yeah, absolutely. I think my main issue here is that government failures are so numerous and so rampant that NGOs have actually come in to not only save lives, but in a lot of cases actually deliver services that everyone is paying tax for. And for me, that's very shameful. I would be very embarrassed if I was government. But over and above that, we saw what happened last year when the president was nominating the Cuban Medical Brigade for a Nobel Peace Prize. Meanwhile, ignoring an organization like Gift of the Givers, which has proven time and time again to actually be doing the work that a lot of people have been begging government to do for a long time. So yeah, for me, Gift of the Givers is really just showing that government incompetence is so widespread. I saw this past week that they're actually, they're installing a borehole at the Helen Joseph Hospital. This is a hospital that's right inside of Johannesburg, right next to the University of Johannesburg even. And yeah, so it actually does hit closer to home. And now it's just got me wondering that, okay, if them drilling a borehole is going to solve a lot of problems, why wasn't this done before? Why isn't there talk of government doing exactly the same sort of projects that the Gift of the Givers are doing, not just in Joburg, but countrywide? And to me, it goes back to what we were mentioning earlier in that cadres haven't from this, and that's why you don't see such projects going out to tender and Gift of the Givers then coming in and saying, right, let's be some good Samaritans, and out of the goodness of our heart or out of humanity, let's go and help people whose lives are negatively impacted and who are actually losing life inside of an infrastructure like a hospital.
Absolutely. Chris, I must come to you. Phil, I'll end with you. The power of voluntary organizations, the power of organizations where people who care about an issue are more effective in mobilizing resources, even more than state welfare programs. This is the future of South Africa, shouldn't it be?
Oh, very much so. It just goes to show you, I mean, the state is in a very bad fiscal position. It could have all the money in the world, and so much goes to inefficiency, to bureaucracy, to government contracts. We talked about this with SAA and Eskom. I think this is exactly the kind of direction in which the country will go, with communities solving problems on their own. It's unfortunate, of course, that they're still being taxed for services that they don't receive. I mean, we can mention the R word here, but I don't think we would, we can't publicly advocate for people to do that, but I wonder if it's going to happen in some way at some point, and people simply deciding this far and no further. That's, of course, up to communities to decide. It also just goes to show you the sort of idea of decentralized knowledge and networks and that kind of thing. When you have the bureaucrats on one side have the sort of hubris where they think they've got the knowledge to decide for 50 million people, 55 million people how to solve problems, whereas that knowledge is on the grassroots level. It's about knowing what's going on around you in your community, what the challenges are, and then solving them appropriately. It just shows you how far voluntary interaction goes versus coercion.
Absolutely. Fully agreed. In fact, Phil, let me segue to you before I give everybody last word and we wrap up the show. It's these sort of initiatives, again, and Gift of the Givers is one organization. There's so many of these community-based organizations, people who genuinely care about each other. It's that masa careless spirit, that do-it-yourself or build-it-yourself spirit that I talk about, that I'm currently, for example, running around the country trying to shoot a pilot for. This is the kind of society we really want, isn't it? I mean, this idea of waiting for the state is it's foolhardy, if anything.
If I'm honest, I find that notion a little bit romantic in terms of I think it's absolutely, the Gift of the Givers and other is utterly amazing, and you just have to applaud what they've done. And I've always been a great somebody who utterly admires and see the best in human beings. We hear about the worst, but actually most human beings are just thoroughly decent people. But these organizations can only ever fill in the gaps. They can't be the solution, and people can't be the solution. The state state is there to provide these functions, and we can't allow ourselves to get in a situation. It won't work if we expect these organizations to carry out the functions of the state. If that was the case, we should just fire the state and absolutely, go way past the tax revolt. We just don't need a state. But then we literally are in anarchy. So we do need a state of a much smaller and a much more efficient state. So I think these organizations are fantastic, but I think it's dangerous for us to over rely on people's charity and people's goodwill and people's community spirit. Actually, we have to get a functional state. And that, in many ways, that also ties back to the one of the things that's been very noticeable for me, who lived my early life in the UK and my later life in South Africa, is the big differences. In the UK, there's absolute division between a competent civil society that is depoliticized and then the political parties that come and go, and that distinction is absolute. And when you come here, it just doesn't exist. At the end of the day, and you don't have competence, you don't have a competent civil service, and that fundamentally is our big issue.
All right.
Sorry, can I just say that added to that sort of organization are the much maligned mining industry, because the big mines tend to make up for the complete lack of service delivery in the communities around them. So it's not just the people who work for them and their families, but it's the broader communities, and the mines take it on, and they're the ones who are complaining about not getting enough wattage for electricity. And we owe these organizations a debt of gratitude. They need to be treated with much more respect by the government than they are.
Well, I can't disagree. Chris, I don't know if you want to add anything before I wrap up. Let me move us on to that final section then, just guys. Final word from everybody. We must close the show. Koketso, I'm going to start with you. In your final word, what are some of the issues you're going to be looking at in the news week ahead? Maybe if you do write, or what's coming on the Manpatria show. Just 20 seconds, please. Let us know what's on your mind. Final word.
Okay, well, I've been quite busy really for the past 3 or so months. So yeah, I'm really taking it everything day by day as it comes in. So in terms of what's actually coming, I'm not even looking forward to anything, to be honest. I'm really taking things as they come. But yeah, again, I think the most important thing really is just do keep in mind that this is an election year. There's a lot of optics out there in terms of fighting corruption and everything. All the right messaging is going to go out to try and get your vote. So always be wary of that and don't take everything at face value.
Absolutely. Sara, final word. Sorry, you're still muted.
Sorry, I echo Koketso's views, and just to say that, in fact, to go along with the idea of really sort of being prepared to stand up and push, is to appeal to people that the more people who push, the better, and is give organizations like ourselves and yourselves the support they need, and they'll help to do it for you. The more there are of us, the more it's likely to happen.
Now you on mute.
What is wrong with us today? A reminder, therefore, as I was saying, as a trick I used to play on my grandfather. Whenever he was really angry, I'd be like, "I'm sorry, grandfather. I just did not." Anyway, I know I'm terrible. A reminder that you can find Sara Gon and her writing on the Daily Friend. That's www.dailyfriend.co.za. Chris, your final word, brother. What are you going to be looking at in the news week ahead, and where do we find your writing? And please punt the Rational Standard too.
Thank you very much, Sikhle, and to the fellow panelists. Always a pleasure to get to talk to all of you and learn from you. In the next week, I'll be traveling a little bit around Southern Africa. I got my COVID test as accurate as they can be back, so I'm free. I'm clear to travel. So I'll be hopping on Ethiopian Airlines and seeing a bit what's happening with trade in Southern Africa. One area of interest of mine around trade policy. Just as a note, at the end of this month, the FMF will be hosting an event with Nick Hudson of Panda, so please keep an eye out for that. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel, just search Free Market Foundation, and then you can get notifications for that event. That's on the 23rd of June. And then at the end of the month, I'll be hosting a podcast with Yaron Brook, who's an objectivist from the United States. We'll be talking about why South Africa needs capitalism after COVID-19. So I also recommend that you check that out. You can find all of my articles and my colleagues' articles at www.freemarketfoundation.com. And you can find us also on Facebook and on Twitter. Thanks very much.
Absolutely. Shout out to the Free Market Foundation, man. And of course, last but not least, Big Phil Craig. Brother, what will you be looking at in the news week ahead, and how do the folks reach you?
I'm a proper good old one-trick pony. my focus is fairly singular. Yeah, look, our website is www.capeindependence.org. We write, and I write for a number of publications. On our website, there's a news and blog section. They're always put on there afterwards with a reference back to the title that published them. And I have to thank both the Rational Standard and the Daily Friend for regularly taking our articles, which is greatly appreciated.
Absolutely, absolutely. Guys, thank you. Greatly appreciated to all of you for being on the show. That, of course, has been my guest for this evening. And let me say thank you, dear viewer, for watching this episode. It's been absolutely fantastic. Good to be back on your airwaves as I travel around the Eastern Cape. I will only be here in PE until tomorrow, and then I make my way down to Cape Town, of course, so that I can be in that part of the world for that massive protest against the Firearms Control Amendment Bill. In fact, on that particular topic, look out for some really awesome content. As I spoke to the people of PE, ordinary residents of PE, asking them the question, what do you think about the government's attempt to take away your ability to defend yourself using a firearm? So look forward to that this coming week. And of course, this Wednesday, as I said, on the Big Daddy Liberty Show, that episode of the Mazakele campaign, the first episode of the pilot of the Mazakele campaign, as I show you the decay of Grahamstown and those residents who are beginning to push back and are building things for themselves in that part of the world. So that's this Wednesday, 7 p.m. on the Big Daddy Liberty Show. With that being said, thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Remember to hit that like button as you exit, and please share the stream. Guys, I really, really, really mean it. Share this stream. If you want to contribute to the show, as little as $2 a month is more than enough to help me put diesel in my bakkie and travel around the country. All of those details are in the descriptor of the video. With that being said, a big thank you to you guys once again. Have a great evening. And remember, as I always say at the end of the show, never trust a commie.